What's up guys, Andre here, and today I'd like to show you how you can use scope slots and renderless components in Vue.js. Scope slots are a really powerful pattern that allow for component reusability across your entire application. Now, I personally like to explain things using very practical examples, so that's what we'll do here. So if you watch my last video on Nuxt.js, I had this component here which pulled from a video game API and list the most popular games in this grid format here. Now I've taken it out from Nuxt and put it in just a vanilla Vue.js project so we can work with it here. So quick overview, we have the parent app component and there's just a container here, and then it calls this game list component, which outputs, well, it gets the games from the endpoint, and then it just outputs it in its markup, and that's what you see here. Now, if your app only required to display this component in this format, then what we currently have is totally fine, and you can reuse the component in your entire application. But say you wanted to use this component somewhere else and you wanted it to look slightly different. So the first example we'll look at is you just want a different amount of columns. So if you look at the markup, the only thing we'd have to change is this. So say you wanted only 3 or 4 columns. Let's try 4. All we have to do is change that. And then now we have 4 columns here. So in this case, we only want this part, actually just this number, to be dynamic. So you might just pass in a prop like this. So maybe you can pass in the columns and you can just pass in a number here and make sure to accept that prop in here. Let's put it here. I'm just going to use an array here, but you should definitely validate it and make sure it is a number, but we'll just use an array here. And let's just say number. Oh, sorry, not number, columns. And now in here in our markup, let me just use a template string here. So I'm just going to do this. And it's going to accept the prop in here. So it's just going to be columns. And let's make sure we're binding that here. Okay. And now that should work here. Okay, so we have 3 columns and we can put whatever number we want in here as long as we have CSS defined to handle it. And I think we have up to 6 to work. So there you go. Cool. But what if we wanted to display our component in a completely new format that requires different HTML? So how would we go about doing that? So say, for example, we wanted to display it like this instead of a grid format. So let me just bring this back. I'm going to remove the prop. And I'm going to bring this back to what it was before without the prop. And I'm just going to paste in some markup as to how that would look like. So I'm just going to paste something in here. I'm just going to comment this out. And then I'm going to paste this in. And let me just remove this. And this is how it would look like in that format, in this format that we want. So let me see how that looks. And there it is. We can even reduce the size of the image, so we don't have to do this thing over here. So there you go. But now this markup and this markup is totally different. So how would we do that? So one approach would be to duplicate this component and make another one for this markup and call it like game list vertical or something like that. But then we would be duplicating all of this code And that is not very reusable because if this changes, then we'll have to change it in two places. So another approach would be to use a prop like we did earlier. So if I accept a layout prop here, so again, I'm going to make a prop section. Again, I'll just use an array here. Let's say layout. And then now we can just conditionally check what type of layout it is. So I'm going to put this back in. And I'm going to do if. So if the layout we pass in, we'll pass it in from the parent in a second. So if the layout equals, say one of the types is grid, then we'll display this markup. And then here we can do an else if, else if, and then we can do another layout, and let's call it vertical. So if I save that, and now we can pass it in here. So actually, we don't even need to bind it. We just do layout equals, and we can say grid. Let's see if this works. So this should be the same. And it is cool. Let me just put it back to 5. I think I just have it as 4 when I changed it initially. So I'm just going to put it back to what I originally had. Okay. But we can totally change that and change it to vertical. And then we'll get the other format. There you go. Or we can have 2. Let's do that and do vertical. And then we'll have 2. So if you have this in one part of your application and this somewhere else, we can reuse the same component. So if we look at this code, what if we wanted to add another format? Then we'll just have to add another else if, and this can get quite messy really quickly. So what can we do to clean this code up? It seems to me like we want to pass in the HTML for how this is displayed from within the parent into this component, and this component can just render whatever's passed into it. So instead of passing in a prop and then conditionally rendering it out in the child component, we're going to pass in the HTML and render that instead. So we want to push the responsibility of rendering the component to the parent instead of here in the child. So this is where scope slots and renderless components come in. So you might be familiar with slots, which allow you to pass in data or even markup from the parent into the child. So if you're not familiar with it, here's a very basic example. I'm just going to comment both of these out for now. And then in here, for the first one, this is where you would pass in your slot, and you can pass in whatever you want here, even including markup. I'll just put a div. I am a slot. And then from it in here, we can just render it out using slot like this. And then that should render it out. Okay, that's cool. So that's sort of what we want. We want to push these two out to the parent. So let me just uncomment this and cut this out and just put it in a new file for now. And let's grab this first one and let's paste it in the parent component right here. Instead of this, we'll paste this in. And let me just indent this, okay? But this is not going to work because we're referencing this games variable, which doesn't exist in this component. It only exists from our child component here. So this is where we would use scope slots so we can pass in this games variable here into the parent, so the parent has access to it and then can render it out, or can pass in the HTML to render it out in the child component. So let's go ahead and do that here. So we no longer need this template section because the markup's going to come in from the parent, and we just want to render in whatever is passed to us. So to do that, we have to make use of render functions. So let's go ahead and do this, render. And we also want to grab the default scope slots. So this scoped slots.default. And then within here, this is where we would pass in or pass up what we want the parent to have access to. So we want the parent to have access to this games variable. So games is going to be this.games. Okay, let me save that. Now within our parent app component, this is still not going to work because we have to accept that variable being passed. And to do that, we just have to go here and add this slot scope attribute. And we are going to destructure the games out. So we're just going to do that. And let me just remove the second one for now. And with any luck, if I did this correctly, this should render out. Okay, I think I have to, yeah, we don't need this anymore. Let's try that again. And there we go. Now we have this rendering out like it did before, but now we're passing in the markup from the parent into the child using scope slots. So let's go ahead and do it for the other format. So yeah, let's do the same thing. Let's just put another H1 in here and say vertical layout or something. Vertical layout. And then now we would uncomment this, and then we'll pass in, yeah, we no longer need this prop. We'll pass in the markup from the parent. So let me grab that from here. And it's going to be this part. And we no longer need this. And let me just re-indent this. Okay, let's see if that works. So there's the first format. And this one doesn't work. What did I do wrong? Oh, I forgot to pass in the games, or accept the games at least. Do that. Yeah, we don't need this layout anymore. And yeah, just do that. And that should work. And there's the vertical layout. So now we have this very clean way of rendering out components however we like, as that's now pushed to the parent. Okay, so let's think about how we can make this component more flexible. So say, for example, we wanted another component that pulls from a different endpoint. Say it was a search or something like that, because this one only pulls from an endpoint that lists the popular games. So we can pass in a prop and say this is the endpoint for popular games, or this is the endpoint for a search, and then we can conditionally check for which one, and then we can change the endpoint there. Or we can just, again, push the responsibility for passing in the endpoint to the parent. So let me show you what I mean. So yeah, we don't need this layout anymore. So let's change this to endpoint. And yeah, as you can see, this is hard coded here, but now we're going to push it to the parent, and we're just going to pass it in from the parent. So I'm going to grab this endpoint, and I'm just going to say this.endpoint, save that. And now in the parent component, we can just pass in the endpoint here. So right now for these two components, it is the same endpoint. So let me just make sure it works still for these two endpoints. So for these two components, I mean. endpoint equals this. Okay, see if this still works. It looks like it does. Okay. But yeah, let's make another one which goes to a different endpoint. So I'm just going to grab this one. We'll just make it the same layout as this one. I'll grab this as well. And let's put it here. And this will be a search for Super Mario. And the endpoint will be something different, but that should still work since we're just passing it in from the parent. So now, if I did that correctly, there's our first component, there's our second component, and there's our third component with a different endpoint. But we are still reusing the logic we have from our original component. So if you take a look at this gameless component, it really isn't a gameless component anymore because it's just a generic component that gets data from an endpoint. So it would make sense to just rename this to something else like get JSON or something. And then we can change this to get JSON. And we can change games to just a generic name. And we'll name it response. And let's make sure we change everything in the parent view. So now we have 3 components, but we are destructuring games out, so we can no longer do that. But what we can do is, let me just grab all of these. We can rename this. So we are destructuring the response now, but in the context of this component, they are games. So we can reuse this, and this should still work. Oh yeah, we have to change everything else. So down here, this should be get JSON. Sorry, this one too. Let's check that out. Oh yeah, and we have to change this game list as well. These are all get JSON now. So let me just replace all of these. So get JSON. See if that works. Okay, so now we have this get JSON component, which only has the responsibility of fetching some JSON and passing it up back to the parent. And the parent is responsible for rendering how it looks. Now, if you take a look at this component, popular games, and this search for Super Mario, there is some duplication here. So, and if we wanted to add another component that looked the same, then we're going to get even more duplication. So how can we go about cleaning that up? So to clean that up, we can just wrap this code into its own component specific to how it looks. So let me show you what I mean here. So for this one, we can just grab everything here. I'm going to cut this. And let's make a new component called grid layout. So let's do grid layout. Actually, let me bring that back for a sec. Let me just comment it out so we can reference it. So grid layout. And we can do the same thing and grab the data from the child component. Let me just copy it. Do this. And we can also pass that in to the actual component. So we can do games equals games, and then we can close it. So now all of this logic, or all of this markup, can get wrapped into this new component called grid layout, or whatever you want to call it. Paste that in, template. Paste that in, on comment. Let's fix the indentation. And we no longer need the slot scope because that's happening in the parent component. And all we have to do is accept that games prop. So let's do props, say games. And that should still work. Sorry, we have to import that. So this grid layout. All right. So there you go, it still works. And we can switch this one over as well. So same deal. Let me just grab what we have up here and replace all of this with a grid layout. And that should still work. Okay, it does, cool. Now we have very flexible and very reusable components. Say for example, this is not only a video game site, but a general media site, and we wanted to display movies somewhere else. Now we can. All we have to do is change the endpoint here in our parent component to fetch movies from a movie API. And we also have total control over how we can display those movies. The only thing we'd have to change here is in this grid layout, we can just make a more generic name for games, because right now we're just dealing with games, but just make it a generic name, say a collection or something. So there you have it, guys. We've taken a look at scope slots and renderless functions to make our components more robust, more flexible, and more reusable. So if you haven't already checked out Adam Wadden's advanced Vue course, you totally should, as this is where I learned all of this stuff and other techniques for designing very reusable Vue components. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already done so. Thanks for watching, guys. See you in the next one. Okay, thanks. Bye.